I'm here this morning with a great panel to continue the theme we've been talking about this morning, all around the Binet Field research. And so I'd like to kick off with my illustrious panel, introducing themselves just very briefly a bit on their company and very briefly their opinion on if Les Binet Fields are right and 60-40 is the way to go. Like, what happens next?
Is, isn't it? Yeah,
I know. Jerry, over to you.
I'm Jerry. I'm part of the global media leadership at GSK Consumer Health with the last year or so. So I lead our EMEA team from a media perspective, and before that I've done time at Diageo. Done time. I loved my time at Diageo. Did time at Cara agency side. Worked at Mondelez as well. Actually, all companies which. I think somewhat coincidentally, during my time there, have rolled out a sort of a combination of Byron Sharp, Binet Field kind of thinking. So yeah, I've seen different companies try and land some of that marketing science thinking through their organisations.
Me, next, right, okay, I'm Elizabeth Yabner, I'm co-founder of 60by9, which is a media agency. We're rather young, even though I'm not so young anymore. Launched at the beginning of the year, and it's a media planning and buying agency, but what we specialise in is TV, so I'm certainly a pro of that. And prior to that, I worked in pretty much most broadcasters, from Sky to Viacom, A&E Networks, and so on. So I've worked on a lot of brands and products and things like that, from spots all the way through to partnerships, including actually Adidas in the good old days, when it was plus 10 Adidas, so yeah.
Hi, I'm Christian. I work for Finecast, which is WPP's response to the change in TV environment. We offer an end-to-end advanced TV platform. It was born from investment in technology, data, and professionally produced TV content. And we effectively offer clients a single point of access to the entirety of the advanced TV ecosystem. It's a global endeavour, but we're live currently in the UK and Australia. More markets come next year. And my role really is about sort of client and partner development, primarily within WPP and Group M agencies, but increasingly with independent agencies and brands direct who are sort of new to TV brands. So that's been really interesting. I think my take on Les and Peter's work is it's a place to start. I think it would be remiss of us to assume that it's a job done. I think if you get to a point where the agencies all start getting to the same endpoint and everyone follows the same rules, the big question is how do you garner a competitive advantage versus other brands? And I think really the secret sauce is how you partner with your agencies and your partners to creatively define a competitive advantage.
Hi, I'm Dan. I've been working in media planning and buying for around 20 years. It'll be 20 years in March. I was just thinking actually that in my very first job I actually was doing the planning and buying for Trainline.com, one of the few survivors of the dot-com bubble that was in 2000. And actually, they spent the vast majority of the money, and a vast amount of money, on TV, out of home, and large format national newspaper advertising. And they're one of those few brands that are still around today. So I think, thinking about it, even though they're a dot-com business, that was how they built their brand, and those are the ones that have survived. I'm now the head of strategy at Starcom in the UK, and at Starcom, we believe in the power of human experiences to make a difference. And what we mean by that is that we really think there is no more important competitive advantage than knowing your customers better than everybody else and then really delivering them experiences that they value. And that obviously that might seem quite obvious, but what that does is we have to do two things. Obviously, we have to understand latest trends, latest developments, and so on, but we also need to understand the things that don't change. And one of those things that don't change is how people relate to and engage with brands and how brands need to be built. And I think the thing that jumps out at me in this question is the thing that all brand building advertising has to fundamentally do at its core. It's not the only thing it has to do, but the thing it has to do is drive fame. Brands need to get famous. And back in 2000, when I was buying TV printed out of home for trainline.com, I could get millions and millions of people to see my advertising very, very quickly. I could become famous very, very quickly. And we had a suite of media tools. We only had 5 media types, and they all made things famous pretty quickly. Those tools aren't as good as they used to be. That's the big problem. So it's fine to say we need to be spending more in brand building. I completely agree with that. My worry is how, when those tools just are more expensive, less reach, not doing the same job that they need to do. And so my question is, how do we do that in the new media world?
So quite a controversial panel ahead of us. And then just to introduce myself as a moderator today, I'm Katie Jones. I run Beeswax in Europe. We're a platform, we work both with broadcasters and brands, really providing programmatic technology that allows them to focus on reach, achieving their goals, potentially if that's GRPs across TVs and all forms of video. So I'd like to come back to the point that Dan started on and really ask a question first around, let's work on the positive assumption that the research is right, and if brands really do need to reduce their activation spend to meet that 60-40 rule, should they cut all activation channels equally, or should they just cull those lower performing ones that are maybe, should they focus on culling those first?
Well, I mean, even if the research is right, you assume that we go too far on the activation side, for instance. So I work with many businesses who go in the other direction, actually, that they go all out for brand and they're not as polished and clear on how they do the activation side. And I think there's also a danger of kind of very casually saying like certain channels do certain things. Obviously there are channels which are better at doing things, but often kind of the creative and the approach to different channels can achieve different things over that kind of brand building activation spectrum. And I think a lot of the dangers of some of those new digital channels is the kind of the performance metrics and the clicks and the numbers that you can easily get hold of are very sort of tempting, and it's very easy to chase those and optimize towards those and do a lot of activity that naturally starts flowing in that direction. Whereas actually a lot of the opportunity that digital channels have brought us is still on the brand building side. It's still getting content in front of people who are starting to consume video in different ways. It was striking from Les's John Lewis slide that can still sometimes be a small part of the pie, but it's an important incremental part of the pie. But yeah, when advertisers are going too far, I guess, in terms of sort of the activation side, I think it is about, yes, not just cutting equally, but learning which ones work best for you and cutting accordingly. But to do that requires truly knowing which ones work best for your business, not just which ones give you the lowest cost per click or something. You have to follow it a bit further down the line.
So is it a fair assumption? Do you think most brands have skewed too heavily towards activation? Well, Elizabeth, you shook your head.
Well, I think I'm thinking of, to be honest, I'm thinking of the client that's new, because we deal with a lot of new to TV or those sort of clients that recognise that they need to scale up. So they need scale and they want TV, but you've got sort of challenges of budget. You've got challenges of the fear of TV, the perception that it sort of has, and the whole sort of like, right, we need to go gung-ho. And so then it's a matter of, if you kind of go out and say to the client, right, okay, you've got your 60-40 rule, and, so we're going to put a bit, on the brand side sort of here, and then the rest on activation, I think we're certainly going to scare them off. So with that, I totally agree, but in the sense of we need to very much adapt to what the brand needs, overall, and then take very much, we do say a lot, is the test and learn. So instead of culling, and just got to go raven, we're going to cull across the board, we're going to test and learn and either dial up or down accordingly. And eventually, certainly in our experience, we've seen that it does fall into the 60-40 rule in the end, but that's more of a gradual process to get there.
I was thinking that it depends on your route to market. So brands that have a natural online route to market, they tend to be the ones that massively overinvest in the activation because they can measure sales and they can measure a connection between activation spend and sales. They then get obsessed with that measurement and they I think there's two things. A, they don't necessarily look at all activation channels that might potentially benefit their business. You know, there are a lot of offline activation channels that can drive connection with a promotion or a price point or that more persuasive messaging that isn't online, but because we can't measure it, we stay away from it. But also, those are the brands that forget the power of brand work, again, because they can't measure it. And I always use the same line, which is, you know, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so kind of back to your point, should we cull just the stuff that isn't performing? The question is, well, what is performance really? What are the things that we're counting? What are the things that we're measuring? And is that really what's driving a business forwards? So I wouldn't say, you know, we shouldn't be in any media that's not driving a positive ROI. If we've got performance media that's a negative ROI, we shouldn't be there. Yet I'm seeing those because they're still measurable, people keep them on a plan.
Wow.
But isn't media systemic as well? I mean, you could point out your lowest performance, as you say, you know, sort of identifying and understanding what performance is, but then even within a specific channel, you've got different media owners, you've got different formats, you've got different audiences. I think it's a very blunt way to look at things. I think there's so much more we can do cross-channel and within channel. And I think one of the other problems with sort of a rise or a leaning towards more activation than brand is just the simple challenge of tenureship. You know, the average tenure of a CMO is, you know, famously known as shorter than 2 years. How do you build long-term return when you haven't got the same people driving towards the same long-term objectives and goals? That's got to be a challenge for most brands.
And do you think that also plays into the measurement and understanding aspect? I think the next question I was going to ask was really around how we improve our understanding of how branding and activation channels are working together. What's the right balance? So when do you hit the right, the optimal media mix? Do you want to start with that, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important that clients take their own data and understand how marketing affects their business. I think there's no silver bullet and no way of sort of circumnavigating that. It requires work, it requires a lot of resource to figure that out. In my area, in terms of advanced TV, it's become quite interesting because we work primarily with clients that are focused on top of the funnel sort of metrics, very much brand-led metrics. But what we're starting to see is, although there's a focus on brand-led metrics, we're actually capturing on the back end in sort of a shorter term, we're actually able to look at sort of more performance style KPIs. So we'll be setting up a campaign to run, sort of looking at awareness, all the things that you associate with the top part of the funnel. But now, because we've got the pipes and we've got the data and we've got a near real-time view on things, we can actually start to see an exposure within our advanced TV platform is driving certain sales or certain footfall. So we kind of get in this sort of straddling of long-term brand metrics and short-term sort of performance metrics.
Interesting. And Jerry, how do you approach that measurement at GSK?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it was interesting hearing like the sort of the John Lewis approach, where they can just, you know, look at what sells in their stores and see what works. And it's striking. I think of 94% TV, which is a heavy TV mix, certainly compared to the industry as large. We, you know, have a challenge in a way that we don't sell our stuff directly. We sell through Tesco and Boots, and there are lots of intermediaries that kind of make it somewhat harder for us to kind of understand exactly which of our levers are driving that. But of course, we use many of the kind of the classic FMCG tools of like MMM analysis and trying to split out, you know, through big econometric analysis. We also try and do some quite more agile, like testing and learning kind of thing. You know, there are TV regions and geo-targeting. You can have slightly different media mixes in different parts of a country and see if that has a sort of macro top-level scale. And I think we're still learning. We are kind of quite actively trying to sort of drive our sort of digital acceleration, because we feel we perhaps we're a little slow there, but we're trying not to push it too far and trying to get to kind of where consumers are and reflecting consumer behavior and consumer activity. But yeah, it's challenging, and if it was easy, I guess we wouldn't need media agencies and consultants and things. So the science is the start of it, but actually trying to tap it, and even depending on kind of your campaign and your brand and the creative assets and things you have, every different campaign can kind of look different. So there's no sort of simple equation, I don't think.
One of the thoughts that this whole question stimulated me is what this means for budget setting as a whole. It feels like these numbers need to shift depending on your total budget, because in order for your brand work to affect your activation work, the same people need to see both of them. So you end up having quite a significant phasing question here. If you've got, let's say you've got a budget for the year of say 5 million, which would be a fairly normal amount for a smaller FMCG brand, that only buys you a few months on air at anything like a significant cut-through rate, but you need to have had that level of cut-through recently in order for the activation work to have a benefit from it. Does that make sense? And so I wanted to quiz Les on this. I did it very briefly in the agreement earlier, because I want to know what does this mean for recency planning? Because part of this work also talks about how penetration is still the most important thing you drive. My understanding is that recency planning is the best way to do that, because it's about affecting the most number of purchase decisions you possibly can. But if you're doing that in such a way that your activation is spread so thinly and your brand budget is spread so thinly, there'll be no overlap between the two pieces of activity. So I think that's a really interesting debate. Is it better to have your brand and your activation in a burst close together so they can work together, but then you're quiet all year long? Or are there ways of using something like your technology to go, actually, we can find ways of ensuring that the people who have been exposed to the brand work are also exposed to the activation work at a lighter level all year long? I think that could be quite an interesting new development in how we think about the application of these spans.
Which is a good challenge. I think some of the Ehrenberg-Bass work and stuff, when they lean towards media guidelines, they're very clear that the best on paper is to spread your media as far as possible, to drive continuity, to be as close as possible to kind of the purchase opportunity, but exactly with limited, and also the idea of reaching all possible category buyers, etc., is fantastic. With limitless budgets, absolutely we would do it. But as soon as you have limits on your budgets and you can't possibly reach every single category buyer all year, you have to start making some decisions. Yeah.
Elizabeth, you mentioned early on that budget is sometimes a big factor, especially with brands who are new to TV.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about how that's impacted maybe your business?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So I'll give an example. So we had a client that had sort of done a little stint on ITV Breakfast, and crashed their site. So like, brilliant, right? We want to go on TV and we want to buy spots there. But then the budget, would essentially have equated to 10 spots for the whole campaign, which of course was not going to particularly work. So it was that whole thing of being able to manage that expectation, be able to, I guess, stretch the budget, but not so much that it's absolutely not going to be effective in any way, but mix it up optimally, and then again manage that and I guess sort of educate on the fact that we did in this particular case need to sort of try that, test, and then learn from that and move on. I think I'm certainly a fan of mixing things up. So it's not just about the 30-second spot. It is about integration, your contextual buy, your... so yes, of sort of TV, but it's not just TV, right? I know we're here and certainly pro TV, but things that can kind of complement maybe not so sort of expensive place, but certainly drive that message.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the pressures on marketers these days move us towards very short spots, like the 10-second spot, 15-second spot. How short can we get it?
Correct.
I mean, it's interesting when you truly look at some of the really great brand-building creatives.
Yeah.
It's tough to do that in.
How much can you say in 5 seconds?
Well, that's
seconds?
exactly right. Yeah, and I mean, I know I'll sort of cite Age UK as an example of where they've just done all sorts of things to really sort of different sort of touch points, get that message across. And certainly the creative was certainly key, But I think you just integrate and sort of mix it up a little, as opposed to just focusing on that ad, that 1 second ad, 30-second ad and 20 seconds.
1 second here.
Well, that would be amazing when it's coming, I'm sure.
That's amazing.
The thing is that though, the 30-second ad was really good at doing that job for a long time.
You said was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You won't make it out here alive.
So the thing is, there's still nothing better than it. But as Les, on his charts right at the beginning, pointed out, is that yes, TV is right up at that top left-hand corner of that chart at the beginning of the day, but it has moved towards the right, and it has moved down, and it will continue to move towards the right and down. And for certain audiences, it's actually a lot closer to that pack. And my worry, I'm a massive advocate of using the media that do that job well. Unfortunately, it costs twice as much now. For the first 11 years of my career, the actual real price of a TV rating stayed basically the same. In the past 5 years, it's doubled against say, 1634 adults. So it hasn't got twice as good. It hasn't got twice as good at what it was doing. And so just because it costs twice as much, but yet you need to put twice as much to achieve the same thing. And
But is it twice as good as other brand-building media?
Probably, yes. But
And a Freddo costs 3 times as much in the same time. So, inflation affects everything as well at the same time. A Freddo, like a chocolate Freddo, used to cost 10p when I first started buying media.
But interestingly, TV didn't. That was interesting. For a long time, the TV price is set based on its ability to achieve something for brands. That's why it's a marketplace system. It's a supply and demand system. People pay up to where it stops being, where it stops giving them a return once they start hitting diminishing returns. We're now paying beyond that mark of diminishing returns because we have to, just to stay still. And my worry is that, and it's not just TV. Out of home has half as many panels in the market as they used to be. You can't buy a National 48 sheet campaign anymore, which used to be like the backbone of a fame-driving, simple message across the country. Print, used to be buying a page across all the newspapers in the country would get you half the country in a day. You can't do that anymore. It's like 20%. There are a lot of brand building tools that have just gone missing. And as seen on TV meant something. As seen on YouTube before I skipped it after 5 seconds before the cat video doesn't say quite as much about a brand. And we've got to find, before it's too late, we've got to find ways in those new media of building brands. How can we be famous in those channels? Because the other areas, TV is going to stay in decline, is going to keep linear TV, the kind of fame-driving stuff, is going to continue to decline. And it's still going to be better than everything else for quite a long time, but it's never going to be as good as it was. So we've got to find other ways in other media of doing those, driving that fame, building those signals. I don't know what that is right now, but we are trying. At Starcom, I work a lot on Samsung, and that's our thing, is how do we create those signals in other media now?
So I think there's some good examples of that. I mean, if you look at what Snickers did around You're Not Yourself When You're Hungry, that sort of cut across all platforms, all screens. Everyone understood that, and I think that sort of brought that sort of water cooler moment back without it just being on TV. I think TV for brands, for long-term growth, is still going to be table stakes. If you think it's inflated now, I can only see that getting worse. Yeah. As more SVOD services come into market, we're seeing it in the US already. You look at Disney Plus in 2 months, it's accrued 50 million subscribers. It took Netflix 3 times as long as that. And that's the general trend in the US. So there's going to be less people to access through commercial advertising. What I think will happen, obviously, is that will do full circle. I think a lot of these subscription-based models will have to look at some hybrid business models whereby the content or the increasing cost of content and increasing cost of producing good quality content is increasing. They'll have to look at different ways of funding that, and it's not going to be a subscription-only model. So I think there's opportunity out there. I think if you've got a means of technology of sort of stitching TV's disparate parts together and bringing data to it so you can identify audiences that you really care about. I still think TV is incredibly strong and it will continue to be so. Yes, it might not be as efficient as it once was, but compared to any other channels, I think it's head and shoulders above everything else.
I think, yes, Snickers is an interesting example, and something like a Snickers or a Specsavers that just about rises from being advert to being, culturally famous enough.
Yeah.
I think there's a watch out that some of what we chase in marketing at the moment, like personalization at scale and very specific programmatic targeting and some of that stuff, which done within a campaign like that can make perfect sense, but kind of done on its own, you run a risk of being sort of super individually relevant to lots of people, but not having a consistent enough idea that there's something you're famous for and tying back together. And Snickers in particular, certainly when they were building that campaign, Mars was probably the single best company in the world at delivering on Ehrenberg-Bass principles. Their media plans were, I used to look at them from a competitive analysis, and they're, freakishly on, off, flighted across the year. I think they've backed slightly away from being as black and white as that. But, they showed that, and although they talked a lot about, some of the search activations and clever stuff they did around that idea, if you actually followed the money, they put it on TV.
Interesting. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the wider context that we operate in terms of really, are there ways of sort of testing or forecasting moving to a sort of 60-40 split before sort of fully committing? Is it possible that if your board buy into it, you get started, the half-year sales numbers come out and they want you to pull out, like, how do you, if the board loses a nerve, what happens?
Well,
by its very nature, you can't test it, because one is the long term and one is the short term. But fortunately, some wonderful people at the IPA have tested it for us over a vast number of different campaigns. Best practice. So I don't think we need to test whether or not it is actually true. We need to test, what we need to do is work out how we can achieve it for our brands. But you're right, people will commit to this at the beginning of the year, and then halfway through go, absolutely, we now need to put it all into promos because we've got to hit a target by the end of Q1. It's not even a year long, it's not even a 2-year thing. It's this quarter, I haven't hit my target. So we're going to switch on the activation stuff, and you end up doing that regularly. It's interesting you mentioned a different model around TV. I think TV sponsorship is probably the best fame-driving medium now. I think the cost per impact is still comparable to what it was a few years ago, and actually makes you famous for something by attaching you to something. But that's the kind of thing that a lot of clients do find it very hard to commit to, because then you're signed up for, there's no way of pulling out of that. If you're doing £5 million on a year-long sponsorship, that's scary. So what we need to do is, I think, is find a way of saying that money, we will target people who have definitely been exposed to that. That's why we've got to find some way of using all of our data and all of our intel to actually better connect the brand and the activation work. So you've got to keep doing that, because it's driving your activation stuff. So like Sky Advance have a great product which allows you to talk to people who have seen certain TV shows or seen your advertising on TV. Obviously that's only in Sky Homes, but I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. You could say, I only want to talk to people who have seen my sponsorship, because I know that they've been engaged with it, their predisposition should be higher, and you should be able to test. You should absolutely be able to see, are people who have been exposed more susceptible, more responsive than people who haven't? So we should be testing, is our activation working better because of brand right now, rather than is 60-40 right? Because I think we all know that intuitively it makes sense. We know that it's right. It's how do we do it?
I agree with Diane, actually, and particularly Sky. That's why I was just thinking that just then, we did apply that where you use sponsorship and then you sort of retarget as a way of, absolutely doing that, and it did work, and we did that for a couple of brands. So that kind of mix. So you've still got the always on, but yes, you're right. Sponsorship, you're selling in sponsorship for the whole year or two. It's quite daunting, but when you're able to show that and sort of show that you'll go past just the sort of branding, I guess, really, and then retargeting with a particular message, that then sort of certainly would hopefully allay. But this is where I guess you need the broadcasters to work with us as well, really, right? So if things aren't working, then we need to be able to have that flex, to work with them to kind of come up with something else, as opposed to being locked in and not being able to kind of to move, which we find that we are managing to do.
Makes sense. How do you find? How do you persuade the board to hold their nerve?
It's a challenge, isn't it? Because yes, brands are held up to quarterly or annual sales targets, and you have to hit a certain level. So even if everyone in the business kind of thinks it's the right thing to do, at some point a squeeze comes. But for me, and amongst this whole topic, one of the key points for me is actually around education, taking people on that journey. I think we're actually, at GSK, we're running a session early next year with some of our C-suite where we're going to talk about Erin Berg-Bass, talk about Binet Field, and really make sure it's on their radar. But right through marketing functions, I know I've seen at conferences like this, if you ask people to put their hands up, I won't do it, but have you read How Brands Grow? Have you read the long and the short of it? It's often less than a third of people that have. If you went into like a doctor's surgery and said, dear doctor, have you read, whatever the most important medical textbook is? My analogy falls down because I don't know what that is. And the doctor didn't put his hand up, you would be terrified.
I think it's Grey's Anatomy.
It's great. Have you watched Grey's Anatomy? Yeah, there you go, the book that started the show. And so for me, that's a really big part, that, whether it's actually having to read the book or making sure that within your business you have training that really teaches marketers that there is some science they have to understand. Also, Eat Your Greens, which is on the table here in chapter 8, is a fantastic read. So
you're kind of advocating for the your chapter. Haven't got that far.
But no, I think a big part of it is tackling like the finance team. I think the Direct Line case study, they talk about moving from being like the crayons department to being like more of a kind of recognised serious business department. You have to be able to come with data, with evidence, with a clear story that because finance have a good and important and tough job to keep the numbers working. And you have to find a way of collaborating with that function and maybe edging things in the direction you want to get to.
Can I ask you one follow-up question? How do you do that education? So I see you're in a EMEA role. One of the challenges I've got is that a lot of this stuff is understood at a UK level, but not necessarily, but the people, their taskmasters are at a global level telling them what to do, and it hasn't necessarily translated. Do you find that?
There's complexity there, definitely in terms of like there being like global agendas with a business. Often the global agenda is not necessarily my company, but in many businesses very like pushes you down a certain route, which may not be right for all your markets. Or at the other end of it, there'll be local markets where, the UK is a very clearly very sophisticated, advanced media market. Across EMEA, we have markets where, their media landscape, to some extent the talent, etc., available is not as skilled up as it needs to be. And that's a challenge, but we do use the Publicist Group, and they're a great partner to us. But yeah, I think that is a challenge of a job like mine, which ends up being somewhat in the middle of everyone, how you bring like a whole team with you, and how we take what we learn in some of our markets, and what we learn in like, for us, GB is a very important market, but it's a super important market because it's so advanced in its media landscape. So what we can learn and prove, and we do tests where we can use Dunnhumby data to like show sales effects of some of our campaigns. We can't do that in a lot of markets, but if we can show it works in the UK, we can scale that learning to other markets where we can't. But yeah, it's not easy.
So Philip, we've got red lights flashing at us. So in terms just to sort of briefly sum up, I think that final point around education, testing, learning, making these decisions on in a measured and informed way seems to be the one area of consensus across the panel. So thank you to everyone for sharing. We could talk for hours on this. So
Thank you.
Thank you.